Story 1. We found the lake house inn by accident, the way you find most things worth remembering in the mountains of eastern Tennessee. My girlfriend Rachel and I had been driving since morning, making our way from Knoxville toward a cabin rental that had seemed perfect when we'd booked it online, but had revealed itself to be double booked when we'd called to confirm directions. The rental company had offered a refund and an apology, but no alternative, leaving us on a back road with fading daylight and no plan for where to spend the weekend we'd been anticipating for months. The inn appeared around a curve I hadn't expected, a Victorian mansion set back from the road on a rise that overlooked a lake I couldn't find on any map. The building was beautiful in the way. Old things are beautiful, all gabled roofs and wraparound porches and windows that caught the sunset in colors that seemed too vivid to be real. A sign at the entrance to the gravel drive advertised rooms available, water views, the kind of quiet that city people pay premium prices to experience. We'd been city people long enough to be susceptible to that particular promise. The owner met us at the door before we'd finished climbing the porch steps. A man in his 60s with silver hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life in these mountains. His name was Harold, he told us, and he'd been running the inn for nearly 20 years, since his father had passed and left him the property, along with the responsibility of maintaining something that had been in the family for 3 generations. He spoke with the easy hospitality of someone accustomed to welcoming strangers, but there was something behind his eyes that I noticed even then, some guardedness that didn't quite match the warmth of his words. He showed us to a room on the 3rd floor, the last room at the end of a hallway that stretched the length of the building. The view was everything he'd promised. The lake spread out below us like a mirror, reflecting the last orange light of a sun that was already touching the ridge on the far shore. The room itself was decorated in antiques that looked genuine rather than decorative, a 4-poster bed and a dresser with a marble top, and curtains that might have hung in those same windows when the house was first built over a century ago. I noticed the other room as we walked to ours, the door at the opposite end of the hall, the one that had no number on it. Every other door we'd passed had been marked with brass numerals, 1 through 6 on the 3rd floor alone, but this door was blank, its surface painted the same cream color as the walls around it, as if someone had tried to make it disappear into the architecture. What caught my attention more than the missing number was the deadbolt, a heavy iron mechanism that was mounted on the outside of the door rather than the inside, positioned to lock something in rather than keep something out. I didn't mention it to Rachel, told myself it was a storage room, a maintenance closet, something mundane that didn't require a number because it wasn't part of the inn's guest accommodations. But I couldn't stop thinking about that deadbolt, about the wrongness of a lock designed to trap rather than protect, about what kind of room needed to be secured from the outside. Dinner was served in a dining room on the 1st floor, a space that had probably once hosted formal gatherings, but now held only a handful of small tables arranged to give each guest privacy. We were the only visitors that night, Harold explained, the off-season having reduced traffic to a trickle that barely justified keeping the kitchen staffed. His wife Margaret prepared the meal, a woman nearly his age, who moved through the service with an efficiency that suggested decades of practice, but who spoke even less than her husband, her eyes carrying the same guarded quality I'd noticed in his. I asked about the room during dinner, tried to make my curiosity sound casual. "The door at the end of the hall," I said. "The one without a number. Is that another guest room?" Harold's face changed when I asked. Not dramatically, not in any way Rachel seemed to notice, but I saw something shift behind his expression, some wall coming up that hadn't been there before. "That room isn't available," he said. "Hasn't been available for a long time. It's not part of the inn anymore." "But the lock?" I pressed, immediately wishing I hadn't. "It's on the outside. That seems..." "The room isn't available." His voice had hardened, the warmth draining from it so quickly I felt the temperature of the conversation drop. "I'd appreciate if you didn't concern yourself with it." He excused himself shortly after, left Margaret to clear the dishes, while we finished a dessert that neither of us had much appetite for anymore. Rachel asked what that had been about as we climbed the stairs to our room, and I told her I didn't know, which was true, but I also knew I'd touched something that Harold wanted left alone, some nerve that ran deeper than a simple question about an unused room should have reached. We went to bed around 10, exhausted from the drive and the stress of the canceled reservation, and the particular fatigue that comes from navigating unfamiliar places when you'd planned for something else entirely. The room was comfortable, the bed softer than I'd expected, and I fell asleep quickly, despite the questions still circling in my mind about the door without a number and the man who didn't want to discuss it. I woke at 2 a.m., pulled from sleep by a sound I couldn't immediately identify. The room was dark except for moonlight filtering through curtains we'd left partially open, the lake visible through the window as a silver expanse that seemed to glow with reflected light. Rachel was still asleep beside me, her breathing deep and even, undisturbed by whatever had woken me. Then I heard it again, footsteps in the hallway outside our door. They were slow, deliberate, the careful tread of someone who didn't want to be heard, but couldn't move silently on floors that had been creaking for over 100 years. I lay still, listening, trying to convince myself it was Harold making some late-night round of the building, checking locks or adjusting thermostats or doing whatever innkeepers did when their guests were supposed to be sleeping. But the footsteps stopped at each door. I could hear them pause, could hear the particular silence of someone standing still outside a room, and then continue to the next door, pause again, continue again. The pattern was methodical, patient, the behavior of someone checking each room in sequence, determining who was inside, and perhaps whether they were awake. The footsteps reached our door and stopped. I held my breath, stared at the strip of light beneath the door that was the only illumination in that part of the room, waited for a knock or a voice or some indication of what whoever was out there wanted. Nothing came, just silence, and beneath it, almost beneath the threshold of hearing, the sound of breathing, heavy and slow, coming from directly outside our door. The footsteps moved on after what felt like minutes, but might have been seconds, continued down the hall toward the room at the end, toward the door without a number. I heard them stop there, heard the particular pause that I'd come to associate with checking, and then I heard something that made my blood feel like it had turned to ice in my veins. The deadbolt sliding open. The sound was unmistakable, heavy iron moving through heavy iron, the mechanism that locked from the outside being drawn back by someone in the hallway. The sound carried through walls that should have been too thick to transmit it, reached our room with a clarity that suggested the building wanted me to hear it, wanted me to know what was happening at the end of that hall. Then the door opened. I heard the hinges, old and unoiled, protesting movement they hadn't experienced in what sounded like a very long time. I heard footsteps enter the room, heard the door close behind them, heard the deadbolt slide back into place. And then I heard the breathing again, not from the hallway this time, not from the room at the end of the hall, from directly outside our door, heavy and wet, the sound of lungs working harder than healthy lungs should need to work. Something was standing outside our room, something that hadn't made footsteps as it approached, something that had been there since the first set of footsteps had passed by or had arrived through means I didn't want to consider. I wanted to wake Rachel, wanted to get up and check the door, verify that it was locked, that whatever was out there couldn't get in, but I couldn't move. Some ancient instinct had seized my body, the prey response that says stillness is survival. That movement draws attention you don't want to attract. So I lay there, rigid beneath blankets that suddenly felt inadequate against whatever waited in that hallway. The breathing continued for hours. I know because I watched the window, watched the darkness slowly, imperceptibly, begin to lighten as dawn approached. The entire time, that wet, labored sound came from just beyond our door, patient and persistent, as if whatever was making it had nowhere else to be and nothing else to do but wait. It stopped when the first real light of morning began to filter through the curtains. Not gradually, not fading, just stopping, as if a switch had been thrown. The silence that followed was almost worse. The absence of that sound, leaving a void that felt physical, that made my ears strain for something to fill it. Rachel woke around 7, cheerful and rested, completely unaware of what I'd spent the night listening to. I didn't tell her. Didn't know how to explain what I'd heard without sounding insane. Didn't know how to describe breathing that came from nowhere and everywhere, a deadbolt that opened from the outside, a room that wasn't part of the inn anymore, but clearly still held something that someone needed to check on in the middle of the night. We went down to breakfast, found Harold already in the dining room with coffee and pastries laid out on the sideboard. He looked at me as we entered, met my eyes with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and warning. "Sleep well?" he asked. There was something in the way he said it, something that told me he already knew the answer, that he'd known what would happen when he gave us that room, that he'd been waiting to see how we'd respond to a night spent listening to whatever walked his hallways after midnight. "We'd like to check out," I said. "Now, if possible." He didn't argue, didn't offer to reduce our bill, or convince us to stay another night. Just nodded, processed our payment, walked us to the door with the same hospitality he'd shown when we arrived, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if every guest eventually left early with the same look on their face that I must have been wearing. "The room at the end of the hall," I said as we reached the porch. "What's in there?" Harold's face did something complicated, emotions passing across it too quickly to identify. "My brother," he said finally. "He's lived there since we were children. He doesn't do well with strangers, but he likes to know who's in the house." "The breathing," I said. "Outside our door. What was that?" Harold looked at me for a long moment, and something in his eyes told me he wasn't going to answer, that some questions were better left unasked, that whatever explanation he might offer would only make things worse. "Have a safe drive," he said. "Don't come back after dark." We drove away from that inn as fast as the gravel road would allow, past the lake that looked so peaceful in morning light, past the Victorian mansion that had probably been beautiful once before. Whatever lived on its third floor had made it something else. Rachel asked what Harold had meant about his brother, and I told her I didn't know, which was true. But I've thought about it constantly in the years since. Thought about the room that wasn't on any map, the deadbolt that locked from the outside, the footsteps that checked every door in the night. I've thought about what kind of brother would need to be locked in, would need to be checked on at 2 a.m., would need to know who was sleeping in the rooms nearby. And I've thought about the breathing outside our door, the wet, labored sound that had lasted until dawn, that had come from something that hadn't made footsteps, that had waited in that hallway with a patience that suggested it had been waiting for a very long time and would wait for a very long time more. I've searched for that inn online, tried to find reviews or records, or any evidence that it exists. I've never found anything. The road we took doesn't appear on any map I can find. The lake doesn't have a name in any database I can access, and the Victorian mansion, that should have been distinctive enough to leave some digital trace, seems to have vanished as completely as if it had never been there at all. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe what we found that night exists in some space that isn't quite on the maps, some pocket of the Tennessee mountains, where things that should have ended long ago continue without regard for the world that's moved on around them. Or maybe Harold has simply gotten better at keeping his secrets, at making sure the room at the end of the hall stays hidden from people who might ask the wrong questions, who might hear the wrong sounds, who might wonder what kind of brother needs to be locked in rather than locked out. I don't drive through eastern Tennessee anymore. Take the long way around whenever business takes me in that direction, add hours to my journey just to avoid the possibility of finding that back road again, of seeing that sign advertising rooms and quiet and views of a lake that doesn't exist. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Some rooms are meant to stay off the map. And some brothers, whatever Harold's might have become, are meant to stay locked away where they can only check on guests in the dark, can only breathe outside doors that strangers are trying to sleep behind, can only wait for dawn to drive away whatever hunger brings them, walking through halls that creak with every step. I still hear that breathing sometimes, in the space between sleep and waking, in the moments when the house settles and my mind tries to convince me something is standing outside my bedroom door. I tell myself it's memory, imagination, the echo of a single night that shouldn't have affected me as deeply as it did. But I always check the locks before bed now, always make sure my deadbolts are on the inside of my doors. And I never, ever ask about rooms that don't have numbers, rooms that aren't available, rooms that innkeepers say aren't part of the building anymore, but that clearly, unmistakably, still hold something that needs to be kept inside. Story 2. The motel appeared around a bend in the road like something that had been waiting for me, specifically 12 rooms in a single-story strip facing a lake that caught the late afternoon sun and turned it into something almost beautiful. I'd been driving since early morning, making my way through western North Carolina on a solo trip that was supposed to be about clearing my head after a divorce that had left me uncertain who I was, without the structure of marriage to define me. The vacancy sign glowed red despite the daylight, and the rates posted on a board near the office were low enough to make me pull into the gravel lot without much consideration. The clerk was a woman in her 50s, heavy-set and friendly in the way people are in small towns, where strangers are still interesting rather than threatening. Her name was Dolores, she told me without being asked, and she'd been running the place for going on 15 years now, since the previous owner had sold and moved somewhere that didn't remind him of things he wanted to forget. She gave me the key to room 7, mentioned casually that it had been recently renovated, and handed me a wooden paddle with the room number burned into it that felt older than I was, older than the motel itself, something that had been passed from hand to hand so many times. The wood had gone smooth and dark with accumulated touch. The room was at the far end of the strip, positioned so its single window looked out over the lake rather than the parking lot. I appreciated that, appreciated the illusion of privacy it provided, even though I could hear the television from room 6 playing something with a laugh track that seemed to mock the silence I'd been seeking. The renovation Dolores had mentioned was clearly cosmetic, new paint over walls that still held the particular smell of decades, new carpet over floors that creaked with every step, new fixtures in a bathroom where the tiles showed grouting that had been white once and had long since surrendered to a gray that no amount of cleaning would remove. I unpacked what little I'd brought, hung my jacket in the closet, and that's when I noticed the first thing that didn't make sense. The closet was too small, not in the sense of being inadequate for storage, though it was certainly that. It was too small for the wall it occupied. From the outside, the wall stretched maybe 8 feet, enough to accommodate a closet of reasonable depth, plus whatever plumbing or electrical ran behind the bathroom. But the closet itself was barely 2 feet deep, just enough space for hangers and the shelf above them, the back wall appearing far sooner than the architecture suggested it should. I told myself it was construction, some quirk of how the building had been designed or modified over the years. Old structures had spaces that didn't make sense, closets that had been reduced for ductwork or access panels, rooms that had been subdivided and reconfigured until their original proportions were lost to history. But something about this felt different, felt deliberate, felt like something had been walled off, rather than simply left empty. The scratches were on the inside of the closet door. I didn't notice them until I was hanging my jacket, until my hand brushed the wood and felt the texture that shouldn't have been there. They were grooves rather than marks, deep enough to catch my fingernails when I ran them across the surface, arranged in vertical lines that started about 4 feet from the floor and extended upward in patterns that looked almost frantic. Some were shallow, hesitant, the scratches of someone testing the wood. Others were deep enough to have exposed lighter layers beneath the paint, the marks of sustained effort, of desperation, of someone who had been trying to get through that door with nothing but their hands and the strength that fear provides. I found myself staring at those scratches for a long time, trying to find an explanation that made sense. An animal, maybe. A dog that had been locked in the closet and had panicked, had scratched at the door trying to escape. But the marks were too high, too organized, too human in their distribution. They were exactly where someone's hands would be if they were standing inside that closet, pushing against a door that wouldn't open, dragging their nails down wood that refused to give. I asked Dolores about them when I went to the office to request an extra pillow. Tried to make my question sound casual, like I was just curious about the marks rather than disturbed by them. Tried to keep my voice light when I mentioned the scratches on the inside of the closet door. Her face changed when I asked. The friendliness drained away, replaced by something that looked like resignation mixed with a sadness she couldn't quite hide. "Room 7, she said, not a question. "I should have given you a different room." "What do you mean?" She was quiet for a long moment, deciding something, weighing how much to tell me and how much to keep to herself. Then she sighed, the sound of someone who had been keeping a secret for 15 years and was tired of the weight of it. "The previous owner's son," she said. "Michael. He disappeared from that room in 1987. She told me the story in pieces, the way people tell stories they don't entirely want to remember. Michael had been 32 years old, a bachelor who'd never quite found his footing, who'd drifted through jobs and relationships and come home periodically to help his father run the motel when things got busy. He checked into room 7 on a Friday in October, planned a weekend of fishing on the lake, told his father he needed some time alone to think about what came next in his life. He'd never checked out. His father had found the room empty Sunday morning, the bed still made, Michael's belongings still arranged on the dresser and in the closet, his car still parked in the lot where he'd left it Friday evening. No note, no signs of struggle, no indication of where he might have gone or why he would have left everything behind. Just absence, sudden and complete, as if Michael had simply ceased to exist sometime between Friday evening and Sunday morning. They'd searched for weeks. Local police, volunteer parties, dogs that had found Michael's scent everywhere in that room and nowhere beyond it. They'd dragged the lake, walked the woods, checked every road and trail, an abandoned structure within 20 miles. They'd found nothing. Not a body, not clothing, not a single trace of a man who had seemingly vanished from a locked room without touching the ground outside it. His father never recovered, Dolores said. Sold the place 2 years later, couldn't stand being here anymore. The room had been renovated twice by then, trying to get rid of things that kept appearing. The scratches. She nodded. First time they painted over them, they came back within a week. Second time they replaced the door entirely. New wood, new frame, everything. Scratches came back within a month. Third time. She paused, something crossing her face that might have been fear. Third time they tried to take out the closet entirely, make the room bigger. The contractor quit halfway through, said he heard sounds coming from behind the wall. Sounds like someone trying to get out. They put the closet back the way it was. I should have asked for a different room. Should have packed my things and found another motel, another town, another stretch of road where the history wasn't written in scratches on closet doors. But something kept me there, some combination of stubbornness and curiosity, and the particular fatalism that had been my companion since the divorce papers were signed. I slept in room 7 that night, or tried to sleep, lying on a bed that was too soft in a room that smelled of decades, despite the fresh paint, listening to sounds that were probably just the building settling, the lake lapping at its shore, the world doing what the world does when you're alone, and straining to hear threats in every noise. The scratching started around 3 a.m. It came from the closet, soft at first, almost tentative, the sound of fingernails dragging across wood in slow, deliberate strokes. I told myself I was imagining it, that the story Dolores had told me was creating sounds where there were none, that my brain was interpreting random noise as something more sinister because I'd been primed to expect it. Then the scratching intensified. Not louder, exactly, but more insistent. The sound of someone who had been testing their surroundings and had decided it was time to try harder. I could hear the rhythm of it, the pattern that was too regular to be random, too purposeful to be explained by animals or settling foundations, or any of the rational explanations I was desperately trying to construct. I didn't get out of bed, didn't investigate, didn't open the closet door, didn't do any of the things that characters in horror movies do before terrible things happen to them. I lay in the dark, listening to sounds that couldn't be real, that couldn't be coming from a closet where nothing should have been waiting, and I waited for dawn with the patience of someone who understood that some investigations were better left unconducted. The scratching stopped when the first gray light began to filter through the curtains. Not gradually, not fading, just stopping, as if whatever had been making the sound had other things to do when morning came, other places to be when the darkness retreated. I checked the closet before I left, stood in front of the door for a long time, working up the courage to open it, to verify that there was nothing inside except hangers and the jacket I'd hung there the evening before. The closet was empty, but the scratches on the inside of the door were deeper than they'd been the night before. Fresher, somehow, the exposed wood lighter in color, as if they'd been made recently rather than decades ago. And there was something else, something I hadn't noticed in my initial inspection, something that made my stomach drop and my hands go cold. At the bottom of the closet, barely visible in the shadow where the wall met the floor, there was a gap. Not much, maybe half an inch, a space where the baseboard didn't quite meet the back wall. I knelt down, looked closer, felt air moving through that gap, cold air that smelled of earth and darkness and something else, something organic, something that had been enclosed for a very long time. The back wall of the closet wasn't a wall at all. It was a panel, a false surface that had been installed to hide whatever lay behind it. And something on the other side of that panel was still there, still scratching at the door that separated it from the room where I'd slept, still trying to get out after 35 years of being walled in. I left that morning without checking out. Left the key on the dresser, left money for the room, left without speaking to Dolores or explaining why I was departing hours before I'd planned to. I drove away from that motel faster than safety allowed, watched it shrink in my rearview mirror until the road curved and it disappeared from sight. I've thought about calling the police, thought about telling someone what I found, what I heard, what I suspect is behind that false wall in the closet of room 7. Michael's body has to be there, has to have been there since 1987, walled in by someone who wanted him to disappear, and has been kept there by owners who either didn't know or didn't want to know what was hidden in the room they kept renting to guests. but I haven't made that call, haven't gone back to that motel, haven't tried to find out what really happened to a man who checked in for a fishing trip 35 years ago and never checked out. Because the scratches on that door aren't old. They're ongoing, fresh, made by something that's still trying to get out after all these years. And I don't know if what I heard scratching in that closet was Michael trying to escape, or something that Michael became after all that time in the dark, or something else entirely, something that's been waiting behind that wall since before Michael checked in, something that's been patient enough to scratch at a door for decades, knowing that eventually, someone would be curious enough to open it. I think about Dolores sometimes, about whether she knows what's in that room, about whether she gave me room 7 on purpose or by accident. I think about the contractor who quit halfway through removing the closet, about what sounds he heard that made him walk away from a job. I think about all the guests who've slept in that room since 1987, who've heard the scratching and told themselves it was nothing, who've seen the marks on the door and convinced themselves they had a rational explanation. And I think about Michael, about a man who came to a motel for a weekend of fishing and found something waiting for him that wouldn't let him leave. About the scratches he must have made on that door, the ones that keep coming back no matter how many times they're painted over, the marks of desperation that have somehow persisted long after the hands that made them should have been still. Room 7 is still there. I checked online, found the motel still operating, found reviews that mention the lake views and the cheap rates, and occasionally, buried among complaints about dated decor and thin walls, mentions of strange sounds at night, scratching that seems to come from inside the closet, a feeling of being watched that guests can't quite explain. The guest who never checked out is still waiting, still scratching, still trying to get through a door that no one has been brave enough to open from the other side. And I wonder, sometimes, in the quiet hours before sleep, when my mind wanders to places I'd rather it didn't go, whether Michael is still trying to get out, or whether whatever got him is trying to get in. Story 3. I found the Lakehouse on a website that specialized in writers' retreats, quiet spaces where creative people could escape the noise of their regular lives and actually produce the work they'd been promising themselves for years. The listing described it as a converted boathouse on a private lake in rural Virginia, complete with a desk facing the water, a small kitchen for simple meals, and the kind of silence that city people forget exists until they experience it again. The photographs showed weathered wood and large windows and a view of a lake so still it looked like glass. I booked it for a week without hesitation, desperate for anywhere that wasn't my apartment and the memories of a relationship that had ended badly enough to make my usual writing space feel poisoned. The owners were a couple in their 60s, the Hendersons, who lived in the main house at the top of a hill that rose steeply from the water's edge. They met me at the property's entrance and walked me down a path of wooden stairs that switched back through trees I couldn't identify, the lake appearing in glimpses between the foliage until we reached the boathouse at the bottom. The structure was everything the photographs had promised, a single room with a sleeping area at one end and a workspace at the other, the entire front wall made of windows that looked out over a dock and the water beyond. Mrs. Henderson showed me how to work the coffee maker and the temperamental lock on the bathroom door, told me where to find extra blankets and how to contact them if I needed anything. Her husband mentioned the canoe tied to the dock was mine to use if I wanted, though he advised against going out after dark when the lake became harder to navigate and the shores all looked the same. They assured me I'd have complete privacy, that the boathouse was self-contained, and they never came down unless asked. Then they climbed back up those switchbacking stairs and left me alone with the silence I'd paid for. The first 3 nights were everything I'd hoped for. I wrote during the day, thousands of words pouring out in a way they hadn't in months. The quiet and the water and the absence of distractions, combining to unlock something that had been stuck since before the breakup. I took breaks to walk the dock, to watch birds I didn't recognize hunting in the shallows, to simply exist in a space where no one knew where I was and no one could reach me. At night I slept deeper than I had in years, lulled by the sound of water lapping against the foundation, the gentle rhythm that was like a pulse, like the lake itself was breathing just below where I lay. The 4th night changed everything. I'd been writing late, caught up in a scene that was finally working after hours of false starts, the words coming faster than I could type them. The boathouse had grown dark around me, the only light coming from my laptop screen and a small desk lamp I'd angled away from the windows to reduce glare. I don't know what made me look up. Some instinct, some sense that I was no longer alone, some primitive awareness that something had changed in the quality of the darkness beyond my reflection. There was a face in the window, pale and indistinct, floating in the glass where my own reflection should have been, watching me with an attention that felt heavier than simple observation. I froze, my hands still on the keyboard, my heart suddenly loud in a chest that had gone tight with a fear I couldn't immediately explain. I told myself it was my own reflection, some trick of the light and the angle that was showing me a version of my face I didn't recognize. I moved to check, tilted my head, raised my hand, did all the things you do to verify that what you're seeing in glass is yourself, and nothing more. The face didn't move with me. It stayed exactly where it was, exactly as it was, watching with an expression that suggested it had been there for longer than I wanted to consider. The features were wrong for mine, the shape of the face too narrow, the eyes too large, the whole impression too feminine for the reflection of a man in his 30s. It was a woman's face, or something like a woman's face, staring in from the darkness beyond my windows with a patience that seemed to have nothing to do with time. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me frozen at my desk and that face floating in the glass, watching each other across a boundary that suddenly felt inadequate. Then I grabbed the flashlight I'd brought from home and went outside, my heart hammering in my throat, my mind racing through explanations that all felt insufficient. The dock was empty, the lake was dark and still, reflecting stars that seemed too far away to offer any comfort. I swept the flashlight across the water's edge, the trees that pressed close on either side of the boathouse, the underside of the structure itself where shadows gathered thick enough to hide anything. I found nothing. No one standing on the dock, no one swimming in the shallows, no one pressed against the windows looking in at a space they had no right to observe. I went back inside, locked the door, and told myself I'd imagined it. Exhaustion and isolation, and the particular vulnerability that comes from working late in an unfamiliar place. The face had been my reflection after all, distorted by angles I didn't understand, given feminine features by tricks of light that my tired brain had misinterpreted. I almost believed it until morning, when I went out to the dock to clear my head before starting the day's work. There were footprints on the wood, wet prints, barefoot and human-sized, leading from the edge of the dock where the water met the planks to the door of the boathouse and back again. The pattern was unmistakable, the outline of toes and heels visible in moisture that was still drying in the early sun. Someone had walked out of the lake during the night, approached my door, and returned to the water without leaving any other trace. I mentioned it to the Hendersons at breakfast. I'd walked up the hill to their house, hoping for conversation and coffee and some explanation that would make the night before seem less impossible. Mrs. Henderson's face did something complicated when I described what I'd seen, what I'd found, and she exchanged a look with her husband that suggested I wasn't the first guest to report these things. "The lake has a history," she said carefully. "A woman drowned off that dock in the 1970 seconds. Helen Marsh. She was staying in the boathouse, same as you, went swimming one night and never came back." "They found her?" I asked. "Never did. The lake's deeper than it looks, and there are currents that don't make sense, places where things that go down don't come back up. They searched for weeks, brought in divers, dragged what they could reach. Nothing. Her family eventually had a memorial service without a body, buried an empty casket in the cemetery up the road." "Mr." Henderson stirred his coffee, avoiding my eyes. "Guests see things sometimes. Faces in the windows, figures on the dock. Most of them don't mention it, check out early without explaining why. The ones who do mention it, they all describe the same thing, a woman's face, watching from outside. They told me this like it was a selling point, a feature rather than a warning. Like the presence of something inexplicable in their rental property was part of its charm, a story to tell friends when I got home, a quirk of the location, rather than a reason to leave immediately. I should have left, should have packed my things and demanded a refund, and found somewhere else to finish my week, somewhere that didn't come with a resident ghost and wet footprints on the dock, and owners who seemed to think haunting was a reasonable amenity to offer guests. But I'd paid in advance, and the writing was going well, better than it had in months, the words flowing in a way that made me reluctant to interrupt whatever spell the lake house had cast. And there was something else, something I didn't want to admit even to myself, a curiosity that was stronger than the fear, a need to understand what I was seeing and why it had chosen me to see it. I stayed 2 more nights. Every night the face appeared, always around the same time, always in the same window, always watching with that patient attention that seemed to have nothing to do with anything I was doing. I tried ignoring it, tried working through the hours when it appeared, tried keeping my eyes on my laptop screen and pretending there wasn't something just beyond the glass that wanted to be seen. It didn't work. The presence was impossible to ignore, a weight in my peripheral vision that drew my attention no matter how hard I tried to focus elsewhere. Eventually I'd look, and there she'd be, pale and indistinct, watching without moving, without blinking, without doing anything except being there in a way that felt both intentional and endless. And every morning, the footprints, leading from the water to my door and back again, wet impressions that dried in the sun and left no trace except the memory of their pattern. Someone walking out of the lake in the dark, someone approaching while I slept, someone returning to whatever waited beneath the surface before dawn could reveal them. I found myself looking at the water differently as the days passed, looking for shadows beneath the surface, for shapes that moved against the current, for any sign of what might be down there in depths that didn't give back what they took. The lake was dark, darker than water should be, absorbing light rather than reflecting it, keeping its secrets in places that divers couldn't reach and dragging operations couldn't probe. I thought about Helen Marsh, about a woman who'd gone swimming one night 50 years ago and never came back, about a body that had never been found, a life that had ended without closure, a disappearance that had become a local legend told to guests who reported faces in windows and footprints on docks. The last night, I did something I shouldn't have. I stayed awake, sat facing the window with the lights off, waited for the face to appear so I could watch it watching me. I don't know what I expected, what I thought I'd learn from observing something that had been observing me for days. But I needed to see it clearly, needed to understand what it was before I left, and never came back. She appeared around midnight, rising in the window like a photograph developing in reverse, her features becoming clearer as I watched. She was young, younger than I'd expected, maybe 30 when she died, with dark hair that floated around her face as if she was still underwater, as if the lake had never let her go even when she surfaced to press against my windows. I stood up, walked slowly toward the glass, stopped close enough that I could have touched the window, close enough that only inches separated my face from hers. She didn't retreat, didn't fade. If anything, she became more distinct, her features sharpening, her eyes focusing on mine with an intensity that felt like drowning, like being pulled under by something that wanted company in the cold and the dark. I don't know how long we stood there, face to face through glass that suddenly felt very thin. Then she smiled, and there was nothing welcoming in it, nothing human, just the expression of something that had been waiting a very long time and had finally found what it was waiting for. I left the next morning, packed my things before dawn, left the key on the counter, climbed those switchbacking stairs one last time, and drove away from that lake without looking back. I didn't say goodbye to the Hendersons, didn't explain why I was leaving early, didn't tell them about the smile or what it had made me feel. I finished my book at home, working in an apartment that suddenly felt safe, despite the memories that had made me flee it. The words came slower there, harder, but they came, and eventually I had something complete, something I could submit and forget. I think about the lake house sometimes, especially at night, especially when I'm near water, and the darkness seems to press closer than it should. I think about Helen Marsh and the face in the window and the footprints that led from water to my door. I think about what she wanted, what she was trying to show me, what might have happened if I'd stayed one more night. And I think about that smile, the one that had nothing welcoming in it, the expression of something that had been alone in the dark for 50 years and had decided it was tired of being alone. I never went back, never contacted the Hendersons, never checked to see if the lake house was still renting, never searched for other guests who might have seen what I saw. Some things are better left unexplored, some questions better left unanswered, some reflections better left unexamined. Helen Marsh is still in that lake. I know that with a certainty I can't explain. Still watching from windows, still walking out of the water in the dark, still smiling at guests who stay too long and look too close. I hope whoever rents that boathouse next has the sense to leave before she decides she's found someone worth keeping. Because I think that's what she's been looking for all these years. Not to be seen, not to be understood, but to find someone who won't run when she smiles, someone who'll follow those wet footprints back to the water, Someone who'll join her in the depths where the divers couldn't reach and the light doesn't penetrate. Someone who'll keep her company in the cold and the dark, the way she's been waiting to be kept company for 50 years. Story 4. We chose the inn for our 10th anniversary, my wife Catherine and I, looking for somewhere romantic enough to remind us why we'd gotten married in the first place. The past year had been difficult, the kind of slow erosion that happens to marriages when careers demand more than they should, and conversations become logistics, and the intimacy that once felt effortless starts requiring effort neither person has energy to give. We needed a reset, a weekend away from everything that had been pulling us apart, a chance to remember the people we'd been when we'd stood at an altar and promised forever. The inn appeared online like an answer to a prayer, a converted farmhouse on the shore of Hollow Lake in eastern Kentucky, promising romance and seclusion, and the particular peace that comes from being genuinely unreachable. The photograph showed a white clapboard building with green shutters, a wraparound porch lined with rocking chairs, and water views from every window. The reviews mentioned candlelit dinners and four-poster beds and owners who seemed to understand exactly what couples needed when they arrived tired and disconnected and hoping to leave as something better. We arrived on a Friday afternoon in late September, the air already carrying the particular crispness that announces autumn in the mountains. The innkeeper met us at the door, a woman in her 60s named Margaret, who had the weathered kindness of someone who'd spent her life welcoming strangers and sending them away happier than they'd arrived. She showed us to the honeymoon suite on the second floor, a corner room with a balcony overlooking the lake and a four-poster bed that she said dated back to the original owners, the couple who'd built this farmhouse in 1892 and had lived here until tragedies of various kinds had scattered their descendants and left the property to pass through hands that didn't share their blood. The room was everything the photographs had promised. Antique furniture arranged with care, windows dressed in lace that softened the light, a fireplace with logs already laid and waiting for the match that would bring them to life. The four-poster bed dominated the space, its dark wood carved with patterns I couldn't quite identify, its canopy draped in fabric that might have been original despite the century, and more that had passed since someone had first hung it there. Catherine loved it immediately. I watched her face as she explored the room, touching the furniture, examining the view from the balcony, testing the mattress, with the particular enthusiasm of someone who'd been needing something beautiful for longer than she'd admitted. Whatever distance had grown between us seemed to shrink in that room, in that inn, in a place that had been designed to help couples remember what they'd forgotten. The first night was everything we'd hoped for. Dinner by candlelight in a dining room where we were the only guests, wine that Margaret had chosen specifically for us, conversation that felt easy for the first time in months. We returned to the honeymoon suite with the particular anticipation that had been absent from our relationship for too long, and when we finally slept, it was with arms tangled together in a four-poster bed that seemed to hold us like a blessing. Catherine woke me at 3 a.m., her hand on my shoulder, her voice a whisper that carried urgency despite its softness. "Do you hear that?" I lay still, listening, trying to identify whatever had pulled her from sleep. At first I heard nothing, just the particular silence of a rural night, the absence of traffic and neighbors, and all the sounds that city dwellers stop noticing until they're gone. Then I heard it, a woman crying. The sound was faint but unmistakable, the particular rhythm of grief that transcends volume and carries through walls and distances that should have muffled it to nothing. Not sobbing exactly, not wailing, but crying in the way people cry when the tears have been falling so long they've become automatic, when grief has settled into something that doesn't need attention to continue. "Where's that coming from?" Catherine whispered. I listened more carefully, trying to locate the source. It seemed to be below us, somewhere on the first floor, somewhere that should have been the dining room where we'd eaten dinner, or the kitchen where Margaret had prepared our meal. But the quality of the sound was wrong, too deep somehow, too muffled, as if it was coming from beneath the floor rather than behind it. "Maybe another guest," I offered, though I knew we were the only ones staying that night, had been told so explicitly when Margaret had mentioned that September was the slow season and we'd have the place to ourselves. "It sounds like it's coming from underground," Catherine said, her voice carrying something that might have been fear, like it's coming from the basement. We lay there listening for maybe 20 minutes, the crying continuing without pause, without variation, without any indication that whoever was making the sound was aware they might be heard or cared if they were. Eventually it stopped, not gradually but suddenly, cutting off mid-breath as if someone had closed a door, or the crier had simply ceased to exist. Sleep came slowly after that. Catherine pressed against me with a tension that hadn't been there when we'd gone to bed, both of us listening for sounds that didn't come again, both of us wondering what we'd heard and why it had felt so wrong. We mentioned it to Margaret at breakfast, trying to sound casual, curious, rather than disturbed. Described the crying, the location it seemed to come from, the time it had started and stopped. Watched her face change as we spoke, the warmth draining away and being replaced by something that looked like resignation mixed with sadness. "I should have checked the calendar more carefully," she said, setting down the coffee pot she'd been holding. "I didn't realize what day it was when you made your reservation." "What do you mean?" She sat down at our table uninvited, the gesture of someone who needed to tell a story she'd told before, but never got used to telling. The original owners of this house were Thomas and Eleanor Marsh. They built this place in 1892, raised 3 children here, were by all accounts happy in a way that marriages weren't always happy in that era. Margaret paused, looking out the window at the lake that glittered peacefully in the morning sun. In September of 1907, Eleanor came home early from a trip to visit her sister. She came up to the room you're staying in, the room she shared with Thomas, and found him with another woman, a younger woman, someone from town who'd been coming to the house while Eleanor was away. What happened? Eleanor didn't confront them, didn't scream, didn't cause a scene. She just walked back downstairs, walked out to the lake, and kept walking until the water closed over her head. Margaret's voice had gone quiet, the tone of someone describing something they wish they didn't have to describe. They found her 3 days later, tangled in the supports under the dock. She'd drowned within minutes of entering the water, but the currents had held her there, kept her trapped beneath the surface, until someone finally thought to look. Catherine had gone pale beside me. And the crying? Guests in the honeymoon suite hear it sometimes, always on the anniversary of her death, always at 3 a.m., which is when they estimate she walked into the lake. The crying comes from the dining room because that's where Thomas found her body. They laid her out on the table, the same table you ate dinner at last night, before the undertaker came to collect her. I felt something cold settle in my chest, a combination of horror and violation, the sense that we'd been sleeping in a dead woman's bed, eating at the table where her corpse had been displayed, celebrating our love in a room where love had been betrayed in a way that led to death. "Why didn't you tell us?" Catherine asked, her voice carrying an edge. "Most guests never hear anything. The anniversary only comes once a year, and most reservations don't coincide with it." Margaret looked genuinely distressed, her hands clasped on the table in front of her. "I didn't check the date when you booked. Didn't realize until you mentioned the crying that you'd arrived on the one night of the year when Eleanor makes herself known. She offered to move us to a different room, to refund part of our stay, to do whatever we needed to feel comfortable. But something about the way she said it, something about the resignation in her voice, made me think there was nowhere in that inn the crying couldn't reach. Eleanor had lived in this house, had died because of what happened in this house, and her grief had soaked into the walls and floors and foundations in a way that no room change could escape. We stayed. I don't know why. Looking back, what combination of stubbornness and expense and unwillingness to let a ghost ruin our anniversary kept us in that room another night. Catherine wanted to leave, made that clear without quite insisting, but I convinced her that one night of crying didn't mean another, that the anniversary had passed, and whatever Eleanor needed to express had been expressed. I was wrong. The second night, the crying started earlier. Around midnight, I woke to find Catherine already awake, sitting up in the four-poster bed with her arms wrapped around herself, listening to sounds that were louder than they'd been the night before. The grief was more present, more personal, as if whatever was making the sound had moved closer, had climbed the stairs from the dining room to the second floor, had taken up a position just outside our door. "It's right there," Catherine whispered. "Right outside. Can't you hear it?" I could. The crying was no longer below us, no longer distant. It was in the hallway, just beyond the door to our room, the sound of a woman weeping, with a despair that felt contagious, that made my own eyes sting with tears I couldn't explain. Then I heard something else. Footsteps, slow and wet, like someone walking on bare feet that had been submerged in water. They approached our door, paused there for a moment that stretched too long, then continued down the hall toward the stairs that led to the first floor. Catherine was crying now, silently, tears running down her face in the darkness. "She's going to the lake," she said. "She's going to do it again." I don't know what possessed me. Some need to see, to understand, to verify that what we were hearing had a source that could be identified. I got out of bed, went to the door, listened for a moment to the footsteps descending the stairs. Then I opened it. The hallway was empty, but there were wet footprints on the floor, leading from somewhere behind me to the top of the stairs, water that glistened in the faint light, coming through windows I couldn't see. I followed them, down the stairs, through the dining room where the table still sat, where Eleanor's body had been laid, out the back door that was standing open despite the hour, despite the cold, despite every reason it should have been locked. The footprints led across the lawn to the dock, and I followed them with a fascination that felt wrong, that felt like something outside myself was pulling me forward. The lake was still in the moonlight, dark and deep and hiding whatever secrets it had accumulated over a century and more of keeping this house company. I stood at the edge of the dock, looking out at water that had claimed Eleanor in 1907 and had held her for 3 days until someone thought to look beneath the surface. I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun, expecting Catherine, expecting Margaret, expecting anyone except what I found, which was nothing. No one stood behind me, no one had touched me. But the sensation had been unmistakable. Fingers pressing into my shoulder with the cold pressure of something that had been submerged too long. I went back inside. Found Catherine where I'd left her, still sitting in the four-poster bed, still crying tears she couldn't explain. We held each other until morning, listening for sounds that didn't come again, waiting for dawn to release us from a night that had felt like drowning. We left before breakfast, packed our things, left money on the dresser, drove away from Hollow Lake without saying goodbye to Margaret or explaining why we couldn't stay another hour. The anniversary weekend we'd hoped for had become something else entirely, a memory that neither of us knew how to process or discuss. Catherine and I are still married, still together, still trying to remember why we made the promises we made. But something changed that weekend. Something broke that we haven't figured out how to fix. She flinches when I touch her shoulder. I can't look at four-poster beds without feeling cold. And neither of us can hear crying without going still, without listening for the particular grief of a woman who discovered betrayal in 1907 and has been mourning it ever since. I think about Eleanor sometimes, about a woman who loved her husband enough that his betrayal drove her into a lake in the middle of the night, about grief so profound it echoes through a house for over a century, about what it means to haunt a place, to leave behind an impression so strong it persists long after the body has been recovered and buried and forgotten. I think about the hand on my shoulder at the edge of the dock, about what might have happened if I'd kept walking, if I'd followed those wet footprints all the way into the water, if I'd answered whatever call Eleanor was making on the anniversary of her death. And I think about Catherine, about the distance that's grown between us since that weekend, about the way she looks at me sometimes when she thinks I'm not watching, not with suspicion exactly, but with something that might be fear, might be wondering, might be asking questions she doesn't want answered. Eleanor walked into a lake because of what she found in the honeymoon suite. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before sleep, I wonder if she's still trying to warn other wives, still crying in the night because she knows what can happen in rooms where love is supposed to be celebrated but sometimes is betrayed instead. I hope we never go back to that inn. I hope Catherine never hears that crying again. And I hope whatever Eleanor was trying to tell us is something we'll never have to understand. Because some griefs are contagious. Some ghosts don't just haunt places. They haunt marriages. They haunt trust. They haunt the space between two people who promised forever and are still trying to figure out what forever means when the crying starts at 3 a.m. and doesn't stop until something walks into the lake and drowns all over again. Story 6. I'd been driving for 6 hours when exhaustion started winning the battle against my determination to make it home in one push. The funeral in Atlanta had taken more out of me than I'd expected. 3 days of relatives I barely knew mourning, an uncle I'd seen twice since childhood, and the drive back to Cincinnati had seemed manageable when I'd started, but had become something else entirely as darkness fell, and the mountain roads of eastern Kentucky narrowed to 2 lanes that wound through terrain, couldn't see beyond my headlights. The motel appeared without warning, a single-story structure on the shore of a lake I didn't recognize, positioned at a bend in the road where the trees opened just enough to reveal water that caught the last light of a sky, going purple with approaching night. The vacancy sign glowed red against the darkness, the only illumination except for a single bulb burning above the office door, and the promise of a bed, any bed, was enough to make me pull into a parking lot that was empty, except for one car near the entrance, old enough that I assumed it belonged to whoever ran the place rather than a guest. The office was small and dated in the way rural motels are dated. Wood paneling on the walls and a counter that had probably been installed when the place was built sometime in the 60s. A bell sat on the counter, the kind you're meant to ring for service. But I didn't need it because the clerk was already there, watching me from a chair that had been positioned to face the door, as if he'd been waiting for someone to walk through it, despite the emptiness of the lot outside. He was ancient, 90 if he was a day, with skin that had gone thin and papery with age and hands that shook when he reached for the registration book that sat on the counter between us. His eyes were the most unsettling thing about him, pale and watery, and seeming to look through me rather than at me, as if he was seeing something behind my face that interested him more than my actual presence. "Room 12, he said before I'd asked for anything, before I'd even said I wanted to stay. Last unit before the lake, best view in the place." I didn't argue, didn't ask how he'd known what I wanted when I hadn't said anything yet. Just handed over cash that he took with trembling fingers, signed a registration card that asked for information I provided automatically, and received a key attached to a plastic fob with the number 12 printed in faded gold. "First guest we've had in 3 weeks, the clerk said as I turned to leave. "Gets quiet out here in the off-season. Sometimes I forget anyone's coming at all." The room was at the far end of the building, positioned so its single window looked out over the lake rather than the parking lot. The door stuck when I tried to open it, required pressure and the particular jiggle that old locks demand, but eventually gave way to reveal an interior that was dated but clean, a bed with a quilted spread in colors that had been fashionable decades ago, a television that probably hadn't worked since before I was born, a bathroom with fixtures that had gone from white to cream with age. I was tired enough that none of it mattered. Dropped my bag on the floor, kicked off my shoes, fell onto the bed without bothering to pull back the covers. Sleep came faster than I'd expected, pulling me under before I'd fully registered the unfamiliar sounds of a lake lapping at a shore just beyond my window. I woke to the sound of doors, opening and closing, one after another, the particular sequence of sounds that motel doors make when guests are arriving or departing or moving between rooms. I lay still for a moment, disoriented by the darkness and the unfamiliar bed, trying to remember where I was and why I was hearing activity in a motel that had been empty when I'd arrived. Then I heard the footsteps. They passed my window at intervals that seemed too regular to be random, the steady rhythm of people walking with purpose, knowing exactly where they were going and not needing to rush to get there. I could hear voices too, muffled by the walls but unmistakably present, conversations I couldn't quite make out, conducted by people I couldn't see. I got up, went to the window, pulled aside the curtain just enough to look out at the parking lot. It was full. Cars I hadn't heard arrive were parked in neat rows, filling spaces that had been empty when I'd gone to sleep. Old cars, I noticed, models I didn't immediately recognize, shapes that suggested decades I hadn't lived through. And between them, walking with the purposeful movements of guests who knew exactly where they were going, were people. Dozens of them, moving from rooms to the office and back again, carrying luggage or walking empty-handed, all of them engaged in the normal activities of travelers stopping for the night at a roadside motel. I watched them for maybe 10 minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, trying to understand how so many guests had arrived without me hearing engines or doors or any of the sounds that normally accompany a parking lot filling with vehicles. Trying to identify faces in the darkness that seemed to resist identification, features that blurred whenever I tried to focus on them, bodies that moved with a fluidity that seemed wrong somehow, too smooth, too coordinated. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. None of them were casting shadows. The light from the motel's exterior bulbs should have thrown shadows across the pavement, should have created the dark echoes that everybody creates when illuminated from above. But the figures walking through that parking lot moved through the light without disturbing it, without leaving any trace of themselves on the ground beneath them. I let the curtain fall back into place, stood in the darkness of my room, with my heart pounding in my chest, listening to doors open and close, footsteps pass my window, voices murmur conversations I couldn't understand. Whatever was happening outside wasn't normal, wasn't real in any way I knew how to process, and every instinct I possessed was telling me to stay inside, stay quiet, stay invisible until whatever this was had passed. The activity continued for hours. I didn't sleep, couldn't sleep, just sat on the edge of the bed listening to sounds that suggested a motel full of guests, when I knew, with a certainty I couldn't explain, that I was the only living person who'd checked in that night. Dawn came slowly, gray light creeping through the curtains, and with it came silence. The doors stopped opening and closing. The footsteps stopped passing my window. The voices faded into a stillness that felt heavy, pregnant with the absence of something that had been present just moments before. I looked outside again when the light was strong enough to see clearly. The parking lot was empty. Not just empty of the cars I'd seen in the night, but empty in a way that suggested nothing had been there at all. No tire tracks in the gravel, no signs of disturbance, no evidence that dozens of vehicles had filled those spaces just hours before. Just my car, alone in front of room 12, and the morning sun reflecting off a lake that looked peaceful and ordinary. I packed my things quickly, wanting nothing more than to leave this place and never return. Stopped at the office on my way out, found the ancient clerk sitting in the same chair, watching me approach with those pale eyes that seemed to see through rather than at. "Sleep well?" he asked, and there was something in the question that felt like a test. "There were other guests," I said. "Last night, dozens of them, cars in the lot, people walking around." The clerk's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, something that might have been recognition or might have been fear. "You were the only one," he said. "First guest in 3 weeks. No one else stayed here last night. I saw them, heard them, doors opening and closing, footsteps, voices." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at me with an attention that felt heavier than the simple conversation warranted. Then he said something that I've thought about every day since, something that keeps me awake on nights when the darkness feels too close and the silence feels too loud. The previous owner drowned in that lake 15 years ago, Carl Mitchell. He'd run this place for 30 years, knew every guest by name, loved this motel more than anything except his wife, who'd passed 10 years before. When he died, his children let the business go. Stopped advertising, stopped maintaining, just kept the lights on and the doors open because they couldn't bear to close it entirely. He paused, his trembling hands folding on the counter in front of him. Carl drowned in October, middle of the night, walked into the lake and never came out. They found his body a week later, caught in the reeds near the shore. No explanation, no note, nothing to suggest why a man who'd lived his whole life by that water would suddenly decide to let it take him. What does that have to do with what I saw? The vacancy sign broke after he died, started glowing all the time, couldn't be turned off no matter what the family tried. Electricians looked at it, said there was no power running to it, no reason it should be lit at all. It just kept burning, kept advertising rooms that no one was staying in, kept inviting guests to a motel that was dying just like Carl had died. The clerk looked out the window at the empty parking lot, at the lake that glittered innocently beyond it. Guests who stay here sometimes see things. Other people, other cars, activity that doesn't match the emptiness of the register. They see the motel the way it used to be, I think. The way Carl wanted it to be. Full of life, full of travelers, full of the purpose that gave his existence meaning. You're saying Carl is still here. I'm saying something is. The sign that won't turn off, the guests that aren't real, the sounds that come from rooms that are supposed to be empty. Carl loved this place too much to let it go, even after he let go of everything else. Maybe what you saw last night was him, still running his motel, still welcoming guests, still doing the work he did for 30 years, even though he's been dead for 15. I left that motel faster than I'd left anywhere in my life. Drove without stopping until I was back on familiar roads, until the mountains of Kentucky were behind me, and the flatlands of Ohio stretched ahead, normal and predictable and free of lakes, with drowned innkeepers and vacancy signs that couldn't be turned off. I've looked for that motel since then, searched online, checked maps, tried to find any record of a lakeside motor lodge in eastern Kentucky where an owner drowned and a vacancy sign burned, despite having no power. I've never found anything. The road I took that night doesn't seem to exist on any map I can find. The lake doesn't have a name in any database I can access. And the motel that should have been distinctive enough to leave some digital trace has vanished as completely as if it had never been there at all. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe what I found that night exists in some space that isn't quite on the maps, some pocket of the Kentucky mountains, where things that should have ended continue without regard for the world that's moved on around them. Or maybe Carl Mitchell is still there, still running his motel, still keeping that vacancy sign lit to attract the travelers he loved to serve. Maybe the guests I saw weren't ghosts at all, but echoes, memories of everyone who'd ever stayed at that motel playing on repeat in a place where time had stopped mattering. I don't drive through eastern Kentucky anymore. Take different routes, add hours to my journeys. Do whatever's necessary to avoid the possibility of finding that road again, of seeing that red vacancy sign glowing against a darkening sky, of checking into a motel where the only guests are the ones who aren't really there anymore. The clerk told me something else before I left, something I've turned over in my mind countless times since that morning. He said Carl Mitchell had been found in the lake with his eyes open, his face turned toward the motel, his body positioned as if he'd been watching the building even as he drowned. He said Carl's children had tried to close the motel 6 different times in the years since his death. Every time they locked the doors and drove away, they'd get calls within a week from travelers who'd stopped there, who'd checked in with a clerk they described as ancient with shaking hands and pale eyes, who'd slept in rooms that were supposed to be sealed and inaccessible. Carl wasn't ready to let go. Carl would never be ready to let go. And somewhere on a lake that doesn't appear on any map, in a motel that exists in some space between the living world and whatever comes after, the vacancy sign is still burning, still inviting guests to stop for the night, still promising rooms in a place where the owner has been dead for 15 years but has never stopped running the business he loved more than life itself. I hope no one else finds that motel. I hope the road stays hidden, the lake stays unnamed, the vacancy sign stays invisible to everyone except those who've already stumbled upon it by accident. But I don't think hope matters much in a place like that. Carl Mitchell wanted guests, wanted purpose, wanted his motel to be full of life, even after life had left him. And something about that want was strong enough to keep going, to keep burning, to keep that red sign glowing against every sunset, inviting travelers to stop for the night in a place where they might never be alone, even when they're the only living person for miles. Story 5. The bed and breakfast appeared on a travel website as exactly what I needed, a Victorian house on a private lake in rural Georgia that promised solitude and history and the particular peace that comes from being somewhere beautiful and unreachable. I'd been working without a break for 18 months, the kind of sustained effort that leaves you hollowed out and uncertain what you're working toward anymore, and my therapist had suggested, in that firm way therapists have, that I take a week somewhere quiet before I burned out completely. The house occupied a point jutting into the lake, positioned so that water surrounded it on 3 sides, and the only approach was a narrow gravel road that wound through trees old enough to have been standing when the property was first developed. The building itself was everything the photographs had promised: gabled roofs and wraparound porches and the kind of ornate trim that people used to add to houses when craftsmanship was still valued. A sign near the entrance said the inn had been welcoming guests since 1923, and every board and window seemed to confirm that claim, the accumulated patina of a century visible in wood that had weathered and settled into something that felt permanent. The innkeeper met me at the door before I'd finished climbing the porch steps. Her name was Vera, she told me, and she'd been running the place for nearly 40 years, since inheriting it from an aunt who'd inherited it from her own mother, the woman who'd first opened the doors to paying guests when the house had become too expensive to maintain as a private residence. Vera was in her 60s, gray-haired and soft-spoken, with the warmth of someone who genuinely enjoyed welcoming strangers into her home. She showed me to a room on the 2nd floor, a corner space with windows on 2 walls that offered views of the lake from multiple angles. The furniture was antique, the bed was covered in a quilt that might have been hand-sewn a century ago, and the overall impression was of stepping backward in time, of occupying a space that had changed less than the world around it. Before she left me to settle in, Vera paused at the door, with an expression that suggested she had something else to say. "There are a few rules," she said, her voice carrying a weight that seemed disproportionate to the words. "Breakfast is at 8, checkout is at 11, and I ask that guests not go outside between midnight and dawn." I waited for elaboration, for some explanation of why a bed and breakfast would have a curfew that sounded more like something from a fairy tale than a hospitality policy. When none came, I asked the obvious question: why not? "The grounds can be treacherous in the dark," she said. "The path to the dock, the stairs down to the water, the terrain around the point. It's safer to stay inside until the sun comes up." I accepted the explanation because it was reasonable. because I had no intention of wandering around an unfamiliar property in the middle of the night anyway. Liability concerns, I assumed. Insurance requirements that forced her to restrict access to areas that might lead to lawsuits if a guest tripped in the darkness and hurt themselves. I didn't ask for clarification. I wish now that I had. The first night was peaceful. I ate dinner at a restaurant in the nearest town, returned to the inn as the sun was setting, spent the evening reading on the porch while the lake turned colors I didn't have names for. I went to bed around 10, fell asleep quickly in a room that was quiet, in a way my apartment in Atlanta never was, and didn't wake until morning light was streaming through windows I'd forgotten to curtain. The second night was different. I'd stayed in that evening, ordered takeout that I ate in my room while reviewing work emails I'd promised myself I wouldn't check. By the time I turned off my laptop, the house had gone quiet, the particular stillness of a building settling into night, and I lay in bed listening to sounds I couldn't quite identify, the creaks and murmurs of a structure that had been standing for over a century. I woke at 1 a.m., pulled from sleep by something I couldn't immediately identify. The room was dark, the house was silent, and for a moment I thought I'd simply surfaced from a dream that had felt urgent but had already faded beyond recall. Then I heard the voices. They came from outside my window, not words exactly, but the rhythm of conversation, the rise and fall of people talking in tones that suggested importance, significance, exchanges that mattered even if I couldn't make out what was being said. Multiple voices, overlapping and interweaving, the particular sound of a group engaged in discussion. I got out of bed, went to the window, pulled aside the curtain just enough to look out at the lawn that sloped down to the water. There were figures on the grass, maybe a dozen of them, standing in a loose circle facing the lake, their bodies motionless, despite the voices that seemed to come from their direction. They were dressed in clothing that looked wrong, styles I couldn't immediately place, shapes that suggested eras I hadn't lived through. Men and women, some standing straight and some slightly stooped, all of them arranged with their backs to the house, their attention fixed on the water that glittered black under a moon that was somewhere between half and full. I watched them for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, trying to understand what I was seeing, trying to find an explanation that made sense. Late-night gathering of some kind, a group that used the inn's grounds for meetings that Vera hadn't mentioned. A local tradition, maybe, something the community did that guests weren't supposed to witness. But the voices were wrong. Too rhythmic, too coordinated, rising and falling in patterns that seemed rehearsed, rather than spontaneous. And the figures weren't moving, weren't shifting their weight or turning their heads or doing any of the things that people do when they're standing in one place for extended periods. They were still in a way that living people aren't still, frozen in postures that suggested statues rather than flesh and blood. I watched them until nearly 4 a.m., watched them stand and murmur, and face the lake with an attention that never wavered. Then, as if responding to a signal I couldn't perceive, they began to walk toward the water. One by one, in the order they'd been standing in the circle, they moved down the slope to the lake's edge and kept going. Walked into the water without hesitation, without sound, without any of the splashing or struggle that would accompany a person entering a lake in the middle of the night. They simply walked forward until the water closed over their heads, disappearing beneath the surface as if the lake was absorbing them, as if they'd been waiting all night for permission to return to wherever they'd come from. I counted them as they went. 12 figures, 12 entries into the water, 12 disappearances that left the lawn empty, and the lake still, and the night silent in a way that felt wrong, too quiet, as if even the insects and frogs had stopped their sounds to watch what was happening. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, sat in the chair by the window, watching the lake, waiting for the figures to emerge, waiting for some indication that what I'd seen had been real, rather than a dream or hallucination, or some break in my overstressed mind. Nothing emerged. The lake stayed still, the lawn stayed empty, and when dawn finally came, painting the water in colors that seemed to mock the darkness that had preceded them, there was no evidence that anything unusual had happened at all. Vera served breakfast as if it was any other morning, moving through the dining room with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this for 4 decades. I watched her, looking for some sign that she knew what had happened, some indication that the events of the previous night were part of her experience of running this inn. When she came to refill my coffee, I asked her about the figures. Her hands paused over the coffee pot, the first break in her smooth routine I'd witnessed since arriving. She didn't look at me, didn't meet my eyes, just stood there for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You saw them," she said. It wasn't a question. A dozen people, standing on the lawn. They walked into the lake around 4 in the morning. She set down the coffee pot, pulled out the chair across from me, sat down in a way that suggested this was a conversation she'd had before and had never learned to find comfortable. This land was a gathering place before the house was built, she said. The lake was sacred to people who lived here long before anyone thought to put a Victorian mansion on this point. They came here for rituals, for ceremonies, for things that the people who took their land didn't understand and didn't want to understand. What kind of rituals? I don't know exactly. My grandmother knew more, learned from women who still remembered, but she didn't talk about it much. She just told me that the gathering continued, that some nights the people who used to come here still came, still walked to the water, still did whatever they'd been doing for centuries before anyone tried to stop them. The rule about not going outside after midnight, I said. It's not about liability. Vera shook her head slowly. Guests who go out when they're here, guests who interrupt what's happening, they experience things. Some of them see things they can't explain. Some of them feel things, hands touching them, voices speaking directly to them. One man, years ago, walked out during the gathering and was found the next morning standing in the lake up to his chest, hypothermic and unresponsive. He'd been there for hours, he said. Couldn't move, couldn't speak, could only stand there while figures walked past him into deeper water and disappeared. Why don't you tell people? Why don't you warn them about what they might see? Would you have believed me if I'd told you yesterday? Would you have stayed if I'd said that the ghosts of people who died centuries ago still gather on my lawn once a month to walk into my lake? She smiled, but there was no humor in it. I tell people to stay inside. I tell them the grounds are dangerous after dark. Most people listen. The ones who don't, the ones who see what you saw, they usually check out early and never come back. I left that morning, packed my things, paid my bill, drove away from that lake and that house and the lawn where 12 figures had stood in a circle, discussing things I would never understand. I've thought about them constantly since then, about what they were doing, what they were saying, why they walked into that water as if it was home, as if the lake was where they belonged and the land was just a waiting room they occupied until they could return. I've thought about the man who walked out during the gathering, who stood in the water for hours while figures passed him on their way to wherever they were going, about what he felt, what he heard, what made him unable to move or speak while the lake rose around him and the cold crept into his bones. And I've thought about Vera, about a woman who inherited a house on land that was sacred before her family ever saw it, who has spent 40 years watching gatherings she can't explain and warning guests about dangers she can't fully describe. The lake had been a gathering place before the inn was built. Some gatherings never really ended. That's what Vera said, and I believe her. Believe that whatever those figures were doing on that lawn, whatever ceremony or ritual or communion they were performing, it had been happening long before there were walls to watch from and would continue long after those walls had crumbled back into the earth they were built on. I don't know who they were, don't know what they wanted, don't know why they walked into water that should have drowned them but instead seemed to welcome them, absorb them, return them to wherever they'd come from. I only know that I saw them, heard them, watched them disappear into a lake that holds secrets older than the house that sits beside it. And I know that somewhere in rural Georgia, on a point jutting into water that was sacred before anyone tried to claim it, the gathering continues. Monthly, maybe, yearly, whenever the conditions are right and the boundaries between then and now grow thin enough for figures to stand on a lawn and face a lake and walk into its depths like they're going home. I hope whoever stays at that inn next listens to Vera's warning. I hope they stay inside between midnight and dawn, keep their curtains closed, sleep through whatever happens on that lawn when the gathering reconvenes. Because some things aren't meant to be witnessed. Some rituals aren't meant for the eyes of people who don't belong to them. And some lakes, when they accept offerings that walk willingly into their depths, don't appreciate being watched by strangers who have no right to see what's being offered or received. Story 7. The motel appeared as motels of its era always appear, a horseshoe of rooms around a courtyard that faced a lake in eastern Tennessee, the kind of place that had been built in the 60s, when families drove cross-country for vacations and needed somewhere affordable to stop along the way. The sign out front advertised cable television and air conditioning as if these were luxuries, and the parking lot was empty except for a pickup truck near the office that I assumed belonged to whoever was working the desk. I'd been driving since early morning, making my way from Nashville to visit a college friend who'd moved to Knoxville years ago and had been asking when I'd finally come see his new house. The trip should have taken 3 hours, but I'd left late and hit traffic and found myself exhausted and irritable by the time I saw the motel's sign glowing against an afternoon sky that was already starting to darken with approaching evening. The friend could wait until tomorrow. What I needed was silence and a bed and a few hours of doing absolutely nothing. The clerk was a young man, maybe 25, with the particular boredom of someone who'd been sitting alone in a small office for too many hours with nothing to do. He perked up when I walked in, seemed genuinely pleased to have a customer, told me the motel was mostly empty and I could have my pick of rooms. I chose room 9, the last unit at the far end of the horseshoe, specifically because it was farthest from the office and the road and promised the most privacy for a weekend of solitude. The room was exactly what I'd expected, dated in a way that felt nostalgic rather than neglected, with a bed covered in a spread that had probably been stylish in 1985 and a television that was newer than the rest of the furniture, but still old enough to suggest the owner updated on a schedule measured in decades. The carpet was worn but clean, the bathroom had been maintained with care despite its age, and the overall impression was of a place that had been doing its job for a long time and would continue doing it for a long time more. The toys were in the corner. I noticed them as I was setting down my bag, a collection of wooden blocks arranged in a loose tower and a stuffed bear propped against the wall as if watching the construction. The bear was faded, its fur worn thin in patches, its button eyes dulled by years of handling. The blocks were painted in primary colors that had softened with age, their edges rounded by countless small hands picking them up and setting them down. They looked like they'd been arranged moments before I arrived, as if a child had been playing in that corner and had stepped away just as I'd opened the door. I went back to the office, found the clerk still at his post, told him about the toys. His face showed genuine confusion when I described what I'd found, the expression of someone encountering something unexpected rather than covering for something they already knew. "Room 9?" he asked. "There shouldn't be anything in there. I cleaned it myself this morning." He came back with me, looked at the toys with an expression I couldn't quite read, apologized repeatedly while gathering them into a plastic bag he'd brought from the office. "I don't know where these came from," he said, and something in his voice suggested he was telling the truth, but also that the truth disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. "I'll get them out of your way. Sorry for the inconvenience." He left with the toys, and I spent the evening doing exactly what I'd planned, watching television and ordering pizza, and enjoying the particular pleasure of being somewhere where no one knew I was, and no one could reach me. By 10 o'clock, I was ready for sleep, exhaustion finally catching up with the day's driving and the emotional weight of a week that had been harder than I wanted to acknowledge. I woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of a child laughing. The sound was high and bright, the particular joy of a small person finding something delightful, the kind of laughter that parents learn to recognize as meaning their child is happy and engaged, and everything is right in their small world. It came from inside my room, close enough that I could almost feel the vibration of it in the air, present in a way that suggested the source was within arm's reach. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, fumbling for the lamp on the nightstand. The light revealed exactly what I expected, which was nothing, an empty room that showed no sign of anyone except myself. The corner where the toys had been was bare. The bathroom door was open, showing darkness but no movement. The front door was still locked, the chain still in place. But the laughter continued. It moved around the room as I listened, sometimes seeming to come from near the television, sometimes from the corner, sometimes from directly beside my bed. It rose and fell in the natural rhythm of a child playing, punctuated by pauses that suggested whatever game was being enjoyed required occasional concentration, then resuming with the same bright joy that had woken me. I searched everywhere, checked the bathroom, looked under the bed, opened the closet, and examined every corner of a room that wasn't large enough to hide anything. I found nothing. No child, no source for the laughter, no explanation for sounds that continued regardless of where I looked or how thoroughly I searched. The laughter stayed with me for hours. Sometimes it seemed close, breath on my ear close, intimate in a way that made my skin crawl, despite the innocence of the sound. Sometimes it was distant, coming from outside near the water, as if the child had wandered out to the lake and was playing in the shallows while I sat alone in a room that should have been empty. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Couldn't sleep, not with that sound filling the darkness, not with the presence of something I couldn't see, but could hear as clearly as I could hear my own heartbeat. I sat in the chair near the window, watching the door, watching the corner where the toys had been, watching for any sign of what was making those sounds. The laughter stopped at dawn, not gradually, not fading with the light, but stopping all at once, as if whatever had been making it had finally tired of the game and had gone wherever it went when the sun came up. I left immediately. Didn't bother to return the key in person, didn't want to talk to the clerk or explain why I was checking out early. Just dropped the key in the overnight slot, got in my car, and drove away from that motel without looking back. I tried to forget about it. Told myself I'd been exhausted, that the unfamiliar room and the stress of travel had combined to create auditory hallucinations that my overtired brain had interpreted as something real. Told myself there was no such thing as ghosts, no such thing as sounds without sources, no such thing as laughter from children who weren't there. But the experience stayed with me, a splinter in my mind that I couldn't remove, no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it away. A month later, unable to stop thinking about that night, I started researching the motel, looking for any history that might explain what I'd heard. I found the article in an archive of local news from 1978. A family from Ohio had been staying at the motel, parents and their 4-year-old son, stopping on their way to visit relatives in Georgia. The boy's name was Timothy. He'd been playing in the room while his parents slept, had somehow gotten the door open, had wandered out into the night and found his way to the lake. They found his body the next morning, floating face down in water that was only 3 feet deep at that spot, water that an adult could have stood in without it reaching their waist. He'd walked in, probably drawn by something he saw or something he wanted, and the lake had taken him before he could call for help or find his way back to shore. The article included a photograph of Timothy, a smiling child with dark hair and eyes that seemed too bright for the grainy quality of the newspaper reproduction. It also described what he'd been playing with in the room before he wandered out, the toys his parents had brought to keep him occupied during the long drive. Wooden blocks painted in primary colors, a stuffed bear with button eyes. The same toys that had been in the corner of room 9 when I'd checked in, arranged as if a child had been playing with them moments before I arrived. I've thought about Timothy constantly since finding that article. About a 4-year-old boy who'd wandered out of his room while his parents slept, who'd found his way to water that had seemed shallow but had been deep enough to take him. About the toys he'd left behind, toys that apparently returned to a room that shouldn't have them, arranged by hands that stopped being able to hold anything 45 years ago. I've thought about the laughter, the high, bright joy of a child playing, the sound that had filled my room all night despite the absence of anyone to make it. I've wondered if Timothy knows what happened to him, if he understands why he can't leave that room, why his toys keep appearing and his laughter keeps echoing in a space where he played his last game before walking into water that wouldn't let him go. I've never been back to that motel, never driven past it, never checked to see if it's still operating, never tried to find out if other guests in room 9 have heard what I heard or found what I found. Some knowledge is better left incomplete, some experiences better left uninvestigated. But I think about Timothy sometimes, especially on nights when I can't sleep, when the darkness feels too close and the silence feels too loud. I think about a child alone in a motel room, playing with blocks and a stuffed bear, not knowing that the lake outside was waiting for him, that the night would end with his parents waking to an empty bed, and a door standing open, and a loss that would define the rest of their lives. I think about the toys that shouldn't have been there, that the clerk said he'd never seen before, that appeared in a room that had been cleaned that morning, as if they'd been placed there by hands that existed outside normal causality. And I think about the laughter, still echoing in that room, still filling the darkness with the joy of a child who doesn't know he's dead, who keeps playing the same game he was playing 45 years ago, who wanders out to the lake every night and walks into water that keeps taking him over and over again. Timothy never checked out of room 9. His parents took his body home to Ohio, buried him in a cemetery I could probably find if I looked hard enough, mourned him for the rest of their lives, and never stopped wondering why they'd slept through the moment when their son walked out of their room and out of their lives. But part of him stayed behind. The part that loved those toys, loved that game, loved the lake that glittered outside the window and called to him with promises it couldn't keep. That part of him is still in room 9, still playing, still laughing, still not understanding why no one comes when he calls, and no one plays with him anymore. I hope whoever stays in that room next doesn't hear what I heard. I hope they sleep through the night, check out in the morning, never know what waits in the darkness of a room that should be empty but isn't. But if they do hear it, if they wake to the sound of a child laughing in a room where no child should be, I hope they understand what they're hearing. Not a haunting exactly, not a ghost in the traditional sense, but an echo, a memory, a little boy who never got to grow up, still playing the same game he was playing the night the lake took him. Timothy is still in room 9, and he'll be there long after the motel crumbles and the lake dries up, and everyone who remembers his name is gone. Some children never stop playing. Some laughter never stops echoing. And some toys, no matter how many times they're removed, always find their way back to the corner where a little boy left them 45 years ago, before he wandered out to see the water, before the night took him and kept him forever. Story 8. The inn sat on a lake in West Virginia, a converted mansion that had been serving guests since the 70s, when the family who'd built it could no longer afford to maintain it as a private residence. I'd found it on a travel website that specialized in historic properties, places with character that the chain hotels couldn't replicate, and the photographs had shown exactly what I was looking for. A grand old house divided into rooms, a lake that stretched toward mountains I could barely see in the distance, and the particular peace that comes from being somewhere beautiful and forgotten. I arrived on a Thursday evening in late October, the last light of a shortened day painting the water in colors that seemed too vivid to be real. The innkeeper was a man named Harold, 60-ish and soft-spoken, with the particular hospitality of someone who'd been welcoming strangers for decades and had learned to do it with genuine warmth. He showed me to my room on the second floor, a corner space that had probably been a parlor or sitting room before the mansion had been divided, with windows that looked out over the lake and walls that bore the marks of construction that hadn't been part of the original design. The room was comfortable, but clearly improvised, the proportions slightly wrong in a way that suggested the walls had been added to create privacy, rather than following any architectural plan. Harold mentioned that the inn had 12 rooms now, carved out of a house that had originally had 5 bedrooms, and that the walls weren't as thick as he'd like, but that most guests didn't mind once they got used to the sounds of an old house settling. I unpacked my things, ate a simple dinner at a restaurant in the nearest town, and returned to the inn as full darkness was falling over the lake. The house was quiet, the hallways empty, and I saw no sign of other guests despite Harold's mention that the inn was nearly full for the weekend. I assumed they'd gone to bed early or were keeping to themselves, the way guests at small inns often do when they want privacy more than community. I fell asleep around 10, lulled by the silence of a place far from the sounds I was used to, far from the traffic and neighbors and constant low hum of a city that never quite goes quiet. The bed was comfortable, the room was dark, and I drifted into the kind of deep sleep that had been eluding me for months. The voices woke me sometime after 11. They came through the wall beside my bed, the wall that separated my room from whatever space occupied the corner of the second floor that I hadn't seen. A man and a woman, their voices muffled but audible, engaged in a conversation that had the particular rhythm of an argument, the rise and fall of accusations and denials and responses that seemed prepared rather than spontaneous. I lay still, listening, trying to make out words through walls that should have been thicker than they apparently were. The argument had the quality of something old, something rehearsed, the kind of fight that couples have when they've been having the same fight for so long it's become ritual rather than communication. He accused her of something I couldn't quite hear. She denied it with a vehemence that suggested the denial was true or had been repeated so many times she'd convinced herself it was. He responded with something lower, something harder, and she raised her voice in response until I could almost make out individual words. Betrayal, trust, years, love. The vocabulary of a marriage that had gone wrong, the particular language of people who had once promised everything to each other and were now negotiating the terms of their destruction. The argument continued for hours. I tried to sleep through it, tried to tell myself it wasn't my business, tried to do what any reasonable person does when they find themselves hearing something private through walls that weren't designed to contain private things. But the voices kept pulling me back to wakefulness, kept demanding attention I didn't want to give, kept filling my room with the sounds of two people destroying something that had once mattered enough to build. Around midnight, I heard something that made me sit up in bed. A sound like a slap, sharp and sudden, the unmistakable contact of flesh on flesh, followed by a silence that felt different from the pauses that had punctuated the argument. This silence was complete, total, the absence of sound that follows an action that can't be taken back. Then footsteps, moving away from my wall, crossing the room I couldn't see, opening a door that I heard clearly through the construction that separated us. The footsteps went into the hallway, down the stairs, fading in a direction that could only lead outside, toward the lake that sat black and still beneath a moon I couldn't see from my bed. I thought about calling the front desk, thought about checking on whoever was in that room, making sure the argument hadn't escalated into something worse. But it was after midnight, and I was exhausted, and I told myself that couples fought, that arguments happened, that what I'd heard was private, and none of my business no matter how thin the walls were. I fell into uneasy sleep sometime after 1, the silence from the next room feeling heavier than silence should feel, pregnant with something I couldn't identify and didn't want to examine. Morning came with the particular brightness of autumn sun, reflecting off water, light that seemed too cheerful for the night I'd spent listening to strangers destroy their relationship through my wall. I dressed and went downstairs, found Harold in the dining room setting out breakfast for the guests, and decided to mention what I'd heard, partly as an apology for the disturbance, and partly because something about the experience was bothering me in ways I couldn't articulate. I wanted to apologize about the noise last night, I said. The couple in the room next to mine were arguing pretty loudly. I hope it didn't disturb the other guests. Harold's face went through expressions I couldn't identify as I spoke, a progression from confusion to something that might have been recognition, to something that might have been fear, all of it passing too quickly for me to be certain of any of it. The room next to yours, he said slowly. Room 8. I assume so. The room on the other side of my wall. That room has been empty all week. Empty all month, actually. We don't book it during the off-season. Too expensive to heat. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The sensation of having been certain about something and discovering that certainty was built on nothing. I heard them, I said. A man and a woman, arguing for hours. I heard footsteps leaving the room around midnight. Harold set down the coffee pot he'd been holding, lowered himself into a chair across from me, with the deliberate movements of someone preparing to say something difficult. Guests in your room hear things sometimes, he said. Have been hearing things for 30 years now, always the same thing. An argument, voices through the wall, footsteps leaving in the middle of the night. What are they hearing? He was quiet for a long moment, looking at me with an expression that might have been pity. In 1989, a couple from Charleston stayed in room 8, Richard and Catherine Marsh. They'd been married for 20 years, had come here for a weekend away from whatever they were trying to escape. They argued the night they arrived, argued loud enough that the guests in your room complained the next morning. But by then, Richard was dead. What happened? They found him in the lake, drowned, maybe half a mile from shore. The official ruling was accident, that he'd gone for a swim in the middle of the night and gotten into trouble. But the water was calm that night, and Richard was a strong swimmer, and no one who knew them believed it was an accident. His wife, Catherine, checked out the next morning, paid her bill in cash, loaded their car, drove away, and was never seen again. The police tried to find her for questioning, but she disappeared as completely as if she'd walked into the lake herself. They never determined what happened to Richard, never established foul play, never closed the case because they couldn't find enough evidence to close it on. Harold looked toward the window, toward the lake that glittered innocently in the morning sun. But guests in your room keep hearing them, hearing the argument, the accusations, the footsteps leaving in the middle of the night. It's like the walls absorbed what happened, recorded it somehow, and play it back whenever someone's there to hear. He offered me a different room, said he'd move me to the other side of the house where the walls were thicker and the history was quieter. I accepted, helped him carry my things to a room that looked out over the front drive rather than the lake, settled into a space that felt different, safer, removed from whatever had happened in room 8 30 years ago. But it didn't help. That night, around 11, I heard them again. Fainter now, coming from further away, but unmistakably, the same voices, the same argument, the same rhythm of accusations and denials that had kept me awake the night before. The walls might have been thicker, the distance might have been greater, but the argument continued, filling the mansion with sounds that should have faded decades ago. I lay in bed listening to a couple fight in a room I wasn't supposed to be able to hear from, in voices that shouldn't have existed anymore, and I understood something that Harold hadn't quite said. The argument wasn't confined to room 8. It had spread, had soaked into the bones of the building, had become part of the inn itself. Whatever Richard and Catherine had said to each other that night, whatever had driven him into the lake and her into disappearance, it had left a mark that couldn't be contained within the walls where it had happened. The slap came around midnight, the same sharp sound I'd heard the night before, then silence, then footsteps, fainter now but still audible, moving downstairs I couldn't see toward a lake I couldn't hear. I didn't sleep at all that night, lay awake listening for sounds that came and went, for an argument that replayed itself on a schedule that had nothing to do with the present, for footsteps that walked toward water that had been waiting 30 years for another victim. I left the next morning, didn't bother to explain to Harold why I couldn't stay, just packed my things, paid my bill, drove away from an inn that had seemed beautiful in photographs, but had turned out to hold something that photographs couldn't capture. I've thought about Richard and Catherine constantly since that weekend, about an argument that went too far, a marriage that ended in a lake in the middle of the night, a wife who disappeared so completely that not even the police could find her. I've wondered what they were fighting about, what accusation or betrayal or accumulated grievance had led to that final night. I've wondered if Catherine killed her husband, or if he killed himself, or if the lake simply took him away. Lakes sometimes take people who swim too far from shore in the darkness. I've wondered where Catherine went, whether she's still alive somewhere, living under a different name, carrying the memory of what happened in room 8, or whether she walked into a different lake, a different body of water that would receive her the way the West Virginia lake had received her husband. The inn is still there. I checked online, found it still operating, still advertising the same lake views and historic character that had drawn me there in the first place. The reviews don't mention the argument, don't mention voices through the walls, don't mention a couple who stayed there in 1989 and left only silence and questions behind. But I know what waits in that building. I know that somewhere in those walls, absorbed into the wood and plaster and improvised construction, Richard and Catherine are still fighting, still accusing and denying and building toward a slap that echoes through rooms that weren't designed to contain such violence. And every night, around midnight, footsteps still leave room 8 and walk toward a lake that has been keeping secrets for 30 years and will keep them for 30 more. Some arguments never end. Some marriages continue long after the people in them are gone. And some inns, when they absorb the worst moments of the people who stayed in them, replay those moments forever. A recording that the walls made without permission and can't stop playing back. Richard Marsh is still walking toward that lake. Catherine Marsh is still standing in room 8, listening to the door close behind him, making whatever decision she made in the minutes that followed. And guests in the room next door are still hearing them, still lying awake, while a marriage destroys itself through walls that were never thick enough to contain what needed containing. I hope whoever stays there next sleeps through it. I hope they don't hear what I heard, don't feel what I felt, don't spend the rest of their lives wondering what happened in room 8 and whether it's still happening over and over in walls that learn to remember and never learn to forget. Story 9. The lake house appeared on a rental website as exactly the kind of escape I needed, a modern structure on a private lake in the mountains of North Carolina that promised architecture and solitude in equal measure. The photograph showed a building all glass and angles, the kind of design that seemed meant to prove humans could impose order on wilderness, with walls of windows that looked out over water and a minimalist interior that suggested someone had spent a great deal of money making a space look like no one lived there. I'd booked it for a week, needing distance from a job that had consumed the previous 2 years of my life, and a relationship that had ended with the particular brutality of two people discovering they wanted incompatible things. The lake house seemed like the perfect place to do nothing, to sit in expensive furniture and look at expensive views and remember what it felt like to exist without deadlines or expectations. I arrived on a Sunday afternoon in late September, following GPS directions that led me down increasingly narrow roads until I reached a gate with a keypad and a code I'd been sent in my confirmation email. The property beyond was exactly what the photographs had promised, a clearing in the trees that opened onto water so still it looked like glass, and at the center of it, the house itself rising from the landscape, like something that had landed rather than been built. The caretaker met me at the door, a man named Frank who'd been maintaining the property since it was developed 5 years ago. He showed me how to work the heating system and the complicated coffee maker and the lighting that was controlled by an app on my phone, then handed me keys I probably wouldn't need since everything was electronic anyway. "Beautiful place," I said as we stood on the deck overlooking the lake. "Has it always been undeveloped like this?" Frank looked out at the water with an expression I couldn't quite read. "The house is new, but the land's been in the same family for generations. They only built on it a few years ago, after the old man who owned it died." "Was there a house here before?" "Cabin, more like. Small thing, way back in the trees. They tore it down when they developed the lot." He paused, something crossing his face that might have been hesitation. "There was a dock, too. Old wooden thing that extended maybe 50 feet into the lake. They took that down decades ago, after the incident." "Incident?" Frank shrugged, the gesture of someone who'd said more than he intended and was trying to minimize it. "Old history. Nothing to do with the new house. You'll have the place to yourself. Cell service is spotty, but the Wi-Fi is solid. Let me know if you need anything." He left before I could ask more questions, his truck disappearing down the gravel drive with a speed that suggested he was eager to be elsewhere. I spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the house, familiarizing myself with systems that seemed designed by engineers rather than people who actually lived in spaces, then settled onto the deck with a drink and watched the sun set over water that turned colors I didn't have names for. The lake was peaceful, the house was silent, and when I went to bed around 10, I fell asleep with the particular ease of someone who'd been exhausted for months and had finally found somewhere quiet enough to rest. I woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of wood creaking. The sound was distinct, unmistakable, the particular groan of planks under weight that I associated with docks and piers, and the wooden structures that extend over water. It came from outside, from the direction of the lake, rhythmic and regular, as if someone was walking on boards that flexed with each step. I lay still for a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar room and the strange sound, trying to identify what could possibly be making it. There was no dock. I'd looked at the property carefully when I arrived, had noted the small beach and the lawn that sloped down to water without any structure interrupting the shoreline. Whatever I was hearing couldn't be what it sounded like. But the creaking continued, steady and insistent, the sound of weight moving across wooden planks that shouldn't have existed. I got up, went to the window that looked out over the lake, and saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. There was a dock extending into the water. It stretched maybe 50 feet from the shore, a wooden structure that looked old, weathered, the kind of pier that might have been built decades ago and had been absorbing the elements ever since. The planks were gray with age, the supports worn thin by water and time, the whole thing looking like it might collapse with any significant weight. And at the end of the dock, standing motionless, was a figure. A man, I thought, though the distance and the darkness made it hard to be certain. He was facing away from the house, looking out at water that reflected nothing but the darkness above it, his posture suggesting someone lost in thought or waiting for something that hadn't arrived yet. I watched for maybe 20 minutes, convinced I was dreaming, convinced that what I was seeing couldn't be real. The figure didn't move, didn't shift his weight, didn't do any of the things that living people do when they're standing in one place. He was still in a way that seemed wrong, frozen in a posture that suggested someone who had stopped moving a long time ago and had simply never started again. Then he turned. The movement was slow, deliberate, the rotation of a body that didn't quite work the way bodies were supposed to work. He faced the house now, faced my window, and though I couldn't see his features through the darkness and the distance, I could feel him looking at me, could feel his attention focused on the exact spot where I was standing. He began to walk. Each step made the dock creak, the same sound that had woken me, wood flexing under weight that it somehow supported despite looking too fragile to hold anything. He moved with a pace that seemed designed to reach a specific destination, unhurried but purposeful, a man who knew exactly where he was going and had no doubt he would get there. The dock ended at the shore, but he didn't stop when he reached it. He stepped onto the beach, onto the lawn, kept walking toward the house with the same steady pace, covering ground that should have put him at my door within minutes. I watched until he disappeared from my angle of view, until he was close enough to the house that the architecture blocked my sightline. Then I waited, heart pounding, for whatever came next. Nothing came. No knock on the door, no sound of someone trying to enter, no indication that the figure who had walked off that impossible dock had reached the house or was standing outside it. Just silence, complete and total, the absence of anything that might confirm or deny what I'd witnessed. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, sat in the living room with every light on, watching windows that showed nothing but my own reflection, listening for sounds that never came. The hours passed with agonizing slowness, dawn arriving with a reluctance that seemed deliberate, as if the night was unwilling to release whatever it had been holding. When the light was finally strong enough to see clearly, I went outside. There was no dock. The shoreline looked exactly as it had when I'd arrived, just beach and lawn and water that lapped gently against sand that showed no evidence of any structure ever having been there. No posts, no planks, no remnants of the wooden pier I'd watched a figure walk off just hours before. I walked to the water's edge, looked out at the lake that stretched peaceful and ordinary toward distant mountains, looked at the spot where the dock had ended, where the figure had stood watching the darkness before turning to face my window. There was nothing there, nothing to suggest what I'd seen had been anything other than a dream or hallucination. But I knew what I'd seen, knew the sound of those creaking planks, knew the shape of that weathered structure, knew the way that figure had turned and looked directly at me before beginning his walk toward the house. Frank arrived mid-morning to check on me, part of the caretaker service included in the rental. I asked him about the dock he'd mentioned, about the incident that had led the family to tear it down. His face changed when I asked, the same expression I'd glimpsed the day before, hesitation mixed with something that might have been fear. "You saw something last night," he said. "It wasn't a question. A dock that wasn't there when I went to bed, a figure standing at the end of it." Frank was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the lake with eyes that seemed to be seeing something other than the peaceful water in front of us. The man who owned this land before the current family developed it was named Harrison Webb. Lived in a cabin back in the trees, kept to himself mostly. He'd built that dock when he was young, used it for fishing and swimming and the things people use docks for. What happened to him? He hanged himself from the supports in 1987. His daughter found him in the morning, had to cut him down herself. She tore the dock down the same day, couldn't stand to look at the place where her father had decided to end his life. But I saw it, last night. I saw the dock and someone standing on it. Frank nodded slowly, the gesture of someone confirming something they'd hoped wouldn't be confirmed. People see it sometimes. The dock, Harrison standing at the end of it, always at night, always around 2 a.m., which is when they estimate he did it. The dock appears, he appears, and then he walks toward whatever house is on the property. What happens when he reaches the house? Frank looked at me with an expression that made my stomach drop. The old cabin burned down in 1992. Fire started in the middle of the night, spread too fast for anyone to get out. The family living there at the time, they'd been renting the place while Harrison's daughter figured out what to do with it. All three of them died before the fire department could get there. And the new house? No one's ever stayed long enough to find out. Guests see the dock, see Harrison, and leave before he reaches them. The owners can't keep renters, can't sell the property, because they'd have to disclose the history. They just keep hoping someone won't see anything, won't ask questions, won't find out what happened here until they've already paid and stayed and left without incident. I left that afternoon, packed my things, forfeited the rest of my rental fee, drove away from that lake house without looking back. I'd paid for a week of solitude and received one night of terror and a morning of revelations that made staying impossible. I've thought about Harrison Webb constantly since that night, about a man who built a dock on a peaceful lake, who used it for decades before deciding it would be the place where he ended his life. About the daughter who found him, who tore down the structure that had become a monument to her father's final decision. About the family who died in a fire that started in the middle of the night, in a house that Harrison had been walking toward for years before they'd moved in. I've thought about what might have happened if I'd stayed. If I'd been in that house when Harrison finished his walk across the lawn he'd owned, through a door he'd once been able to open, into rooms that had been his before they'd been anyone else's. I've wondered if the fire in 1992 was coincidence or consequence, accident or something that Harrison brought with him when he finally reached the place he'd been walking toward since the night he died. The lake house is still there. I've checked online, found it still listed on rental sites, still advertising the architecture and the views and the solitude that had drawn me there in the first place. The reviews are sparse, and no one mentions a dock that appears at night or a figure that walks toward the house with purpose that transcends death. But I know what waits at that lake. I know that some nights, when the conditions are right, Harrison Webb still stands at the end of a dock that was torn down decades ago, still looks out at water that holds whatever secrets he brought with him when he tied that rope and stepped off those planks. And I know that eventually, he turns. Eventually, he walks. Eventually, he reaches whatever house sits on land that still belongs to him in ways that property deeds can't capture. I hope whoever rents that place next sees the dock in time. I hope they leave before Harrison finishes his walk, before he reaches the house, before they find out what happens when a man who hanged himself 40 years ago finally completes the journey he started the night he died. Because some walks don't end with death. Some journeys continue long after the person making them has stopped breathing. And some docks, no matter how thoroughly they're torn down, keep appearing in the darkness, waiting for the figure who still stands at their end to turn and begin walking toward whatever warmth and light he can still see from the water. Story 10. The storm came out of nowhere, the way they do in the Virginia mountains when weather systems collide over ridges that have been channeling wind and rain for longer than humans have been around to notice. I'd been driving since early afternoon, making my way from Richmond to a conference in Roanoke that had seemed important when I'd registered months ago, but now felt like an obligation I was fulfilling out of habit rather than enthusiasm. The GPS had routed me through back roads to avoid an accident on the interstate, and by the time I realized how remote those roads were, the sky had gone from gray to black, and the rain had started falling with a violence that made driving impossible. I pulled over when I couldn't see the road anymore, when the wipers were useless and the headlights died 3 feet from the car. Sat in the driver's seat listening to rain pound on the roof like fists, watching lightning illuminate a landscape I didn't recognize, feeling the particular helplessness of being stranded in weather that could kill you if you made the wrong decision. The inn appeared in a flash of lightning, a stone building on the shore of a lake I hadn't known was there, its dark windows and empty parking lot suggesting it had been closed for years. But it was shelter, real shelter, walls and a roof that would protect me from a storm that showed no signs of stopping. I made my decision in the next flash of lightning, grabbed my bag from the back seat, and ran through rain that soaked me to the bone in the 30 seconds it took to reach the building's front porch. The door was unlocked. I didn't question it at the time, was too wet and too cold and too desperate to do anything except push through into an interior that was dark but dry, that smelled of dust and age and the particular mustiness of a building that had been closed up too long. I fumbled for a light switch, found nothing that worked, and used my phone's flashlight to examine a lobby that had clearly once been something grand. The furniture was covered in sheets that had gone gray with accumulated years, the dust thick enough on every surface to suggest the place hadn't been touched in at least a decade. A reception desk stood against one wall, its surface buried under papers and ledgers, and a bell that probably hadn't been rung since whatever guests had last checked out. The walls were paneled in dark wood, hung with paintings I couldn't quite make out in the dim light, and a staircase rose toward the second floor with the kind of elegance that suggested money had been spent here once, back when the inn had been something people sought out rather than stumbled upon. I found candles in a drawer behind the reception desk, matches beside them, and lit enough to see my way up the stairs to the second floor. The hallway stretched in both directions, doors marked with brass numbers that had gone green with oxidation, and I chose a room at random, one with a number that felt lucky, one with windows that would look out over the lake when there was enough light to see it. The room was like the lobby, dusty and abandoned but intact. The bed was made, though the linens had gone stale with years of disuse. The furniture was antique, heavy and dark, the kind of pieces that were made to last and had proven themselves by surviving long after the people who'd commissioned them. I set my candle on the nightstand, stripped off my wet clothes, wrapped myself in a blanket I found in a closet, and settled onto the bed to wait out the storm. I fell asleep despite myself, exhaustion winning over the strangeness of my situation. The sound of rain on the roof became white noise. The flickering candle became a comfort rather than a reminder of how dark the building was without it, and I drifted into a sleep that was deeper than I'd expected in a place so unfamiliar. I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. The candle had burned down but not out, its diminished flame casting shadows that moved in ways I didn't like. The storm was still raging outside, rain and wind, and the occasional crash of thunder that shook the building. But beneath those sounds, threading through them like something separate and intentional, I could hear someone walking in the hall outside my door. Not one person. Multiple people, their footsteps overlapping, moving in both directions, the sounds of guests going about the business of an evening in an inn that should have been empty. I heard doors opening and closing, the creak of floorboards under weight they hadn't borne in years, the murmur of conversation that I couldn't quite make out, but that had the particular rhythm of people talking to each other, exchanging pleasantries, discussing plans. I told myself it was the wind, told myself it was the building settling, the sounds old structures make when weather puts pressure on materials that have been absorbing the elements for decades. Told myself there was no one else here, that I'd seen the parking lot empty and the building dark, and there was no possible explanation for footsteps and voices except my own imagination, overactive and anxious in an unfamiliar place. But the sounds continued all night. Footsteps that passed my door at intervals, conversation that rose and fell from the floor above me, doors that opened and closed in patterns that seemed too regular to be random. I lay in that bed wrapped in a dusty blanket, listening to an inn that had been closed for years, filled with activity that couldn't be real, that couldn't be anything except the products of a storm and a stressed mind, and the particular paranoia that comes from being alone somewhere you shouldn't be. Dawn came slowly, the storm retreating with reluctance, the rain tapering to drizzle, and then to nothing, as the sky lightened from black to gray, to something that almost resembled day. The sounds had stopped by then, the footsteps and voices fading with the darkness, leaving a silence that felt heavy with the absence of something that had been present just hours before. I got dressed, gathered my things, and went downstairs to a lobby that looked exactly as it had when I'd arrived, dusty and abandoned, and showing no sign that anyone except me had been there in years. The candles I'd lit were the only disturbance in the dust. My footprints, the only tracks on floors that should have shown others, if the sounds I'd heard had been made by anything with weight. The guest book was on the reception desk, leather-bound and thick, the kind of register that inns had kept before computers made such things obsolete. I opened it without quite knowing why, flipping through pages filled with names and dates and comments from guests who'd stayed here over what appeared to be decades of operation. The entries were faded but legible, a chronicle of travelers who'd found this place and recorded their visits with handwriting that ranged from elegant to illegible. The entry stopped abruptly in October of 1987. The last page with writing on it showed 7 names, 7 rooms, 7 arrivals, dated October 15th. Below them, in handwriting that was shakier than the entries above, someone had written "God forgive us" and nothing else. A newspaper clipping had been tucked between the pages, yellowed with age but still readable. The headline read, "8 dead in Mercy Lake in fire," and the article below described a tragedy that had occurred on October 16th, 1987, when a fire had started during a storm and had spread too quickly for anyone to escape. The owner, a man named Robert Marsh, had died along with 7 guests who checked in the night before, all of them trapped when the flames blocked the only staircase and the fire department couldn't reach the remote location in time. The article listed the names of the dead. I recognized them from the guest book, from the entries on that final page, from the 7 arrivals who had come to Mercy Lake Inn on October 15th and had never checked out. I recognized something else too, the voices I'd heard through the night, the fragments of conversation that had drifted through walls and floors, and the particular stillness of a building that shouldn't have held anyone except me. I couldn't have identified them consciously, couldn't have picked them out of a lineup or described their particular qualities. But something in me recognized them, knew them, understood that what I'd heard wasn't imagination or wind or the settling of old wood. I'd spent the night in an inn full of people who had died there 36 years ago. I left immediately, didn't bother to close the door behind me, just ran to my car and drove away from that lake and that building, and the guest book that recorded a final night that had ended in fire and death, and an inn that had never reopened because everyone who might have reopened it was gone. I've researched Mercy Lake Inn since that night, found articles about the fire, about the investigation that never determined how it started, about the families who'd sued the estate and the property that had sat abandoned ever since, because no one wanted to build on land where 8 people had burned to death. I've found other things too. Reports from people who'd stumbled on the building over the years, hikers and drivers who'd sought shelter during storms and had heard things they couldn't explain, footsteps in empty hallways, doors opening and closing, conversations from rooms that had been vacant for decades. The inn holds on to its final guests. That's the only explanation I've found that makes sense, the only theory that accounts for what I heard and what others have heard in the years since the fire. Robert Marsh and his 7 guests are still there, still checking into rooms they'll never check out of, still walking hallways that lead to a staircase that's been gone since the flames took it. They're still waiting out a storm that ended 36 years ago, still talking to each other in voices that carry through walls that absorb their final hours. Still going about the business of a night at an inn, not knowing or not accepting that the night ended differently than any of them expected. I haven't been back to Mercy Lake, haven't driven those roads, haven't sought out that building, haven't put myself in a position where I might have to shelter in a place where the dead still walk and talk and open doors that should be locked forever. But I think about them sometimes, especially during storms, especially when rain falls heavy enough to make the road disappear. I think about Robert Marsh in his lobby, checking in guests who'll never leave. I think about the 7 people who signed their names in a book that became their memorial. I think about the fire that started during a storm and took them all before anyone could help. And I think about the building itself, still standing despite years of neglect, still holding on to whatever remains of the people who died inside it. Stone walls that absorb screams and smoke, and the particular horror of a night that wouldn't end the way nights are supposed to end. The storm lasted all night. That's what the article said about October 16th, 1987. The storm lasted all night, and by morning, Mercy Lake Inn was a ruin and 8 people were dead, and whatever dreams they'd brought with them had turned to ash along with everything else. I slept in that building. I heard them, and I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if they knew I was there, if they heard me the way I heard them, if somewhere in that endless night they're still waiting out. A stranger in room 12 provided a moment's variation in an existence that otherwise never changes. The inn is still there, the lake is still there, and Robert Marsh and his 7 guests are still there too, checking in forever to a building that will never let them leave, waiting out a storm that will never end, talking in voices that carry through walls to anyone unfortunate enough to seek shelter in a place where shelter became a trap and a single night became an eternity.